Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here on this beautiful, sunny day. We are delighted to have the opportunity to share with you cutting-edge research about the effects of abuse and neglect on the developing brain, strategies for reducing the impact of implicit bias on decision-making, and recent developments on transition planning, keeping children in foster care safe, and the services to incarcerated parents, and many other topics. I'm looking around and thinking of where we were all last year and thinking, wow, what a year it has been. And I suspect that no matter where you are on political leanings, maybe the last 12 months may have been stressful. And in these divisive times, I think it's really important to remember that there are many things that unite us. And one of those things for every single person in this room is that the safety and well-being of children in our great state. So thank you for your commitment to the safety and well-being of children. I find a lot of inspiration in great people and the wisdoms that they can impart on us. So before I turn the podium over to Judge Pellegrini, I'd like to leave you with one quote that has been resonating with me lately. Dr. King once said, "An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for recognizing that what happens to one child happens to all children. Thank you for taking the next step and doing something about it. For humanity has no greater concern than the safety, health, and well-being of all of our children. I am pleased to introduce the Honorable Cheryl Pellegrini. Judge Pellegrini was appointed to the Marion County Circuit Court in 2014. She worked for almost 19 years before that with Oregon Department of Justice as in attorney and management positions there. She was the attorney in charge of the Organized Crime Section, the Deputy Chief Counsel for the Civil Enforcement Division, and the Chief Trial Counsel of the Trial Division. Judge Pellegrini earned her BA and JD from the University of Oregon. After law school, she started her legal career down in Klamath Falls, where she clerked for a circuit court judge and worked as a deputy DA. Since February, Judge Pellegrini has served as the chief juvenile court judge here in Marion County. I've spotted her riding her bike around Salem. She's an avid cyclist, and she told me on her way this morning, on her way here today, she was thinking we were in another location, so she rode her bike there and then rode her bike here. I think she just wanted to be outside riding her bike. So thank you for being here, Judge.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'm also really pleased to welcome you to our lovely city, especially on a sunny day. So welcome to Salem, city of peace. I want to just say a few words about why the work that you do and the work that I get to do now means so much to me. And it starts where I started out, as Leola said, down in Klamath County. I was a deputy DA from 1988 to 95. And I ended up prosecuting sex crimes. And I did adult sex crimes. I worked with juvenile sex offenders. And then I did all the dependency cases that related to them. In the early 90s, I prosecuted the case involving a father who was sexually abusing his daughter. And it was a successful prosecution. His daughter was, she was about 10 years old at the time the case went to trial. The jury convicted the father. He was sentenced to the penitentiary for a number of years. The daughter had testified during the trial, and after the verdict came in, she was at the DA's office, and I met with her to tell her what the verdict was. And she just broke down and started to sob. And she looked at me and said, "Where am I going to go now? You've taken my dad." because as it turned out, her mom had not been part of her life for a long time, and as reprehensible as her father's conduct was, he was the only stable person that she had ever known in her life. And she went into the foster care system, and I lost track of her. And I realized with that case that the role of a deputy district attorney and a prosecutor was good as far as it went, but there was so much more that families needed that we couldn't provide because it was not our role as prosecutor. The thing about being a judge and the thing about the work that you're doing is that, I found myself for years after wondering, what next? What happened? Well, as being a member of the juvenile bench, I now get to be part of the process that determines what happens next. And it's the question I've always felt really awful about not being able to answer, and I'm just so grateful about being able to try to answer it now, as you are. So a lot has changed since the mid-90s in what we know about what children need when they come into care, and what is the best thing for us to do. As a new member of the juvenile court bench, I have a lot to learn. And fortunately, as a judge, I've got the Juvenile Court Improvement Project. And like the CRB, that's part of the Judicial Department's Juvenile Family Court Programs Division. Through JSIP, as we call it, I've had the opportunity to participate in conferences that they put on for judges every year. I have access to Loyola Mackenzie, thank God. One resource that I was provided is it's the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the enhanced version of resource guidelines. I'll tell you why this is relevant. It was written to improve court practice in child abuse and neglect cases. It was an update to an original resource guidelines that was published more than 20 years ago. The original resource guidelines was the blueprint for training and technical assistance that was developed and provided by national organizations like the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the American Bar Association for Lawyers, and the National Center for State Courts. Now, leveraging the value of a national effort and perspective like this, these resource guidelines were also used here in Oregon by the Juvenile Court Improvement Project and the CRB to improve how we respond to cases that arise in our state. Both federal and state laws require that periodic reviews be conducted 6 months after a child has come into foster care, and that these periodic reviews can be conducted by either a court or administrative body like the CRB. Now, this is from the resource guidelines. This is sort of how we got to where we are today. The purpose of a periodic review is to determine the continuing necessity for and appropriateness of placement, the extent of compliance with the case plan, and the extent of progress which has been made towards alleviating or mitigating the causes necessitating placement in foster care, and to protect and to project a likely date by which the child may be returned to a home or placed for adoption or legal custody. Like I said, the enhanced version of the resource guidelines says that the best alternative to judicial review is review by a panel of judicially appointed citizen volunteers. Whatever the form of review that's used, it's critical that whoever is doing the reviewing be present and that the questioning be rigorously conducted. The enhanced guidelines go on to say, in terms of what the composition of the review board should be, that these citizen review panels should be carefully recruited, screened, trained, and supervised by court personnel. The panel should be judicially appointed and supervised. There should be an adequate ratio of court staff to volunteers and at least one panel per 100 children to be reviewed. A professional staff person should be present at all panel reviews. A citizen review should be coordinated with the court review so that families and other case participants don't spend unnecessarily time in duplicative reviews. And courts should receive and consider reports generated by the review panels. All CRBs in Oregon meet these requirements. In Marion County, we all operate probably a little bit differently, but here in Marion County, we actually conduct 3 reviews, 2 by the court, 1 by a citizens review panel within the first 12 months of a child coming into care. The first one is at 4 months. That's conducted by the court. Our CRB review is at the 6-month mark, and then the court does one at the 9-month mark. In 2016, the court conducted 372 permanency hearings, and our CRB conducted 281 reviews. We have 6 boards in Marion County, and who's here from Marion County? You just sort of raise your hand. Okay, so people around here, hello and thank you. Without your work, it would be difficult for the juvenile court here to pick up the cases that you review to make sure that we're meeting the timelines and to do reviews as thoroughly as is required by federal and state law. How the, in talking to, is Molly Johnson here? In talking to Molly Johnson, who's the head of our citizen review boards here in Marion County, I've been really impressed with our CRB's knowledge of child welfare policies and issues, and of how effective they've been of holding DHS accountable through findings and recommendations, and their ability to identify areas for needed system improvements. In fact, you're going to hear from Michael Livingston about a methodology that was developed here in Marion County that now has come to be known as issue-focused review. And it emerged from the work of Michael's board, which is it the adolescent or the youth in transition board in particular? You'll be hearing about that this afternoon. That's important because how you fulfill your role as a CRB has evolved, certainly since I was a deputy DA in the 90s, and probably even more so in the past 5 or 6 years. What we now have is an overtaxed child welfare system, and one where, because of that, the response becomes reactionary, not measured. What happens when a system becomes reactionary? We've all seen it. Responses become really inconsistent. They're not considered in terms of responses, immediate responses to reports of children being abused. In terms of placement, those placement decisions are not driven by what a particular child or group of children in a family need at a particular point in time if removal becomes necessary, but those decisions are driven more by what space might be available. I'm not telling you anything new because you probably all have read the Peake report, and that's exactly the conclusions that that report came to. Now, more than ever, it falls upon you, citizen review boards, to more fully step into your role and to exercise your authority, to review, to identify areas of concern, to make recommendations. I can tell you that I read those reports, I pay close attention. I look at a couple of sections, particularly since we've got the issue-focused review method. I'll always zero in on the issues that the board has spent the most time with, and then I go right to the recommendations, and then I make notes to myself. Because when I conduct my next review, don't you know those are going to be the first questions I'll be asking. So your work just helps us do our job so much more effectively. And looking at your brochure this afternoon, it looks like you have a program that is really geared towards helping you conduct better, even more effective and efficient reviews that fully consider the safety, permanency, and well-being of children in the foster care system. It appears that this conference is really going to help you to be able to ask those hard questions. And by asking those hard questions, you'll be able to figure out and make recommendations to address the problems and improve case planning for children to contribute to the services being in place for those children as well as for their parents, and to help children achieve timely permanency. I really want to thank you all for your service to the state. Your engagement in the child welfare system is an indispensable asset to our state, our communities, and our courts. I really can't thank you enough. Welcome.
Okay. For the past 5 or 6 years, Michael Livingston, who serves as a Citizen Review Board volunteer board member and on the Statewide Advisory Council, has been working with Dr. Phil Fisher, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, to bring the science of brain development in children into juvenile court thinking and practice. Michael Livingston, I really appreciate him for coordinating and bringing this next keynote session for us. For those of you who don't know, Michael attended Washington and Lee University for his BA, and he earned his JD at Willamette University. Michael was a law clerk for the Oregon Supreme Court and Oregon Court of Appeals prior to becoming an assistant attorney general for the Department of Justice. He worked at DOJ from 1984 to 2008. In 2008, he then became the juvenile court referee here in Marion County. And then in 2011, I was lucky enough to steal him from the court, and he worked as our juvenile law staff counsel for the Judicial Department before he retired in 2013. Mr. Livingston has presented numerous educational sessions on juvenile court law, practice, and reform to judges, attorneys, legislators, CRB members, and CASAs. Joining Michael today is Dr. Shannon Peake. He earned his PhD from the University of Oregon in 2015. Shannon is a postdoctoral researcher in the Stress Neurobiology and Prevention Lab, which is called the SNAP Lab, and he's at the University of Oregon as well. Dr. Peake is primarily interested in the influence of social factors on cognitive skills and brain development. His research is based on the reciprocal ideas that social interaction can strongly influence anatomical and functional brain development, and that brain development in turn contributes to individual differences in social interaction. Thank you, Michael and Dr. Peake, for being here today, and I'm going to turn the podium over to you.
Thank you, Leola. I'm privileged to be here today, and I want to start a little bit of conversation or a presentation by telling you 2 stories, one of which you may have already heard, the other is a personal experience. But I'd ask that you think about these stories not just through this presentation, but perhaps through the whole conference. The first is the story that you may have already heard. A couple are leaving a theater late at night, walking down the sidewalk to their home. And up at the next corner, under a stoplight. They see a man on his hands and knees, feeling with his hands under the stoplight, and as they approach him, they see he's more and more agitated. And so they stop and they say, "What's going on here? Are you okay?" And he said, I lost my keys. I have to find them. I need to get home. I heard them drop when I was walking through the alley over there. And the couple said, "Well, let's go over there and look for them. Why are you here?" And he said, "Because the light is better." My personal story is that about 8 years ago, I was at a meeting with juvenile court judges and legislators and DHS folks, and around the room, folks were making some comments about the child welfare system. And the one comment that really stuck with me was a comment that a former Lane County juvenile court judge made, and he said, "You know, we call this a child welfare system, but it really isn't. It's a fix the parent system. Because once the process starts, the children go on a shelf, and we expect them to just wait and be there and be okay when either the parents are fixed or there's another option for them." So again, I'd ask you to keep those two stories in mind as we go forward and see to what extent, if any, they apply to you, your board, or the work that you do. That same year that I heard that comment, I was fortunate enough to attend a presentation by Dr. Fisher, Dr. Peake's colleague down at the University of Oregon, about what I call, and I think what he calls, brain science. And what it was the report of a research project that he had done with children in foster care. One group had been placed in what we call therapeutic foster care, the other one wasn't. And the real message that I got from that is summarized in the summary of the presentation that you're going to hear today. And what that is that the architecture of the brain, the human brain, begins in utero and continues to build into adulthood, but the most important development occurs in childhood. Now, abuse and chronic neglect create a physiological response called toxic stress, which prevents healthy brain development. And removing a child from an abusive or neglectful home doesn't stop that process. It continues to go forward. And that was the key lesson, or the key piece of information to me from that presentation. So our sort of white hat, rescue the child, fix the parent paradigm just doesn't fit the results that we're seeing from neuroscience. That is, that toxic stress effect continues to prevent healthy brain development even after the child is removed from an abusive or neglectful home. And unless it's affirmatively and consistently addressed, it will continue to redirect the architecture of the brain, impairing cognitive ability, compromising the ability for self-regulation and emotional control, and causing burdens to both physical and mental health as the children move into adolescence and on into adulthood. Dr. Peake is going to talk about the science that underlies that reality, but the reality should prompt us to begin to question that the light's better over here, that parent-centered focus, because regardless of what the permanent plan is in a case, finding number 3A is the most important finding that we will make. So I'm really privileged to be here today to introduce Dr. Shannon and introduce you to this science. Dr. Shannon. Dr. Peake, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for the invitation to come here. Wait, get my clicker out. Okay. As you know, I'm standing in for Phil Fisher today. He was not able to make this. And what I'm going to talk about are 3 different things. I'm going to be talking about how early experience affects brain development and development in general from a couple of different perspectives. I'm going to be talking about how toxic stress influences those patterns, and more importantly, how the physiological aspects of that development change children's behavior. Like, how is that linked to children's behavior? And then we're going to talk about some interventions that we've been testing to see if we can change that course. Can we start to put that course back on track? And that's the focus of this talk. There we go. I want to, before I start, just mention a little bit about Phil. And Phil is the Philip H. Knight Chair and Professor of Psychology at University of Oregon. It's an endowed chair. He's also the director for the Center on Translational Neuroscience, and he's the director for the Translational Science Initiative and science director for the National Forum on Early Childhood Policy and Programs at Harvard University. The reason I mentioned that, aside from crediting Phil, whose work I'm going to be talking about today, is that the idea of translational neuroscience is that what we're doing is we're trying to do basic research on physiological changes, and we're trying to link them to what interventions can we actually do? What can we do to help these kids get back on track? And Phil's at the forefront of that effort. He's working quite a bit on multiple fronts. So he's working on research projects that are doing neuroimaging, stress system research, as well as direct implementation of interventions we're doing here in Oregon and around the United States. So today, even though you're going to hear me saying the ideas, many of these ideas are Phil's, and our lab together as a team works on them. Quick acknowledgements. A lot of the scientists and researchers and clinicians in our lab are responsible for the results we're going to be showing today. The Stress Neurobiology and Prevention Laboratory, as well as the Oregon Social Learning Center, based in Eugene, does a lot of work with intervention development for children and service delivery for kids. We also collaborate extensively with the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, and some of the videos and materials you're going to see today were developed in partnership with them. And I just want to give a quick acknowledgement too to our funders who make this work possible. So we get funding from foundation sources, places like Chimera, the Bezos Family Foundation, Buffett Early Childhood Fund, but we also get a lot of funding from the National Institute on Child Health and Development and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Okay, I want to start off by talking about influences on child development. It's probably a little hard to read some of those words, but essentially what we're looking at here is, in the center, we've got the child. Michael, I think, mentioned just a minute ago that sometimes we get focused on the parents or the circumstances, but really this view puts the child in the center. And what we're doing is looking at what are the immediate influences on the child. So in that middle ring, you'll see things like the family and school and healthcare services. These are aspects of that child's environment that touch them directly. And then on that outer ring, the gray ring, you'll see there's some additional influences that affect the child, but they're a little bit more indirect. They're not touching the child generally directly. And those are things like social welfare services, also the legal system, and a number of services that you folks are involved with. And so when we, as psychology researchers and intervention developers, think about interventions, we think about things that affect the child directly, like, can we bring the child in? What about mental health, behavioral health treatment directly for the child? But we also think about things that affect the child's environment. So when we provide services, sometimes the best way to affect the child's environment is by the family. And in a way, that's what you people are involved with, changing the child's environment, either through plans for their natural family or for foster care or a different area of care. But it's the environment that's shaping how that child's developing. And I also want to mention that each of these areas interact. So when you, on this outside gray ring, are making changes to the way you're doing your job, it's also affecting those inner parts. It's affecting the child's family, it's affecting the type of services they get, And all that contributes to their development. Looks like we have questions. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's just not playing well. So in the middle here, we have a question about what are those terms. Let's say on the white circle, just above the baby, we've got family, playground, peers, religious institutions, healthcare services, and school. Those are things that tend to touch kids directly. And on the outer gray ring, we've got things like the extended family at the top, neighbors, can't really read that other one. What does that say? Mass media, right? Increasingly. Social welfare services, legal services, and friends of the family. And then all of those different parts, the parts that touch the child directly and indirectly, those are all nested in cultural considerations for that family. And sometimes those are cultural considerations that we all share, things like these kids live in the United States, they live maybe in Oregon, but then they also have different, depending on their background and when and where they came from, they have different cultural considerations. So the idea here is that each of these rings has got an influence up and down and that they influence each other. So the first saying here, the first adage, if you do what you always did, you'll get what you always got. That's been attributed to a number of different people. It's been attributed to Einstein, it's been attributed to Henry Ford, also to Mark Twain. I was looking it up to see what was the actual, who actually said it. Couldn't find it. But I will say that one of the earliest instances of that saying recorded was from a woman named Jessie Potter. And Mrs. Potter was the founder and first director of the National Institute on Healthy Family Development in 1965. And she used this saying to make the point that if there is a social problem that we're trying to address, sometimes we need to move out of the type of thinking that was involved when that has not been working on that particular problem. So I just want to mention how that plays into our thinking about how can we approach these problems in an innovative way. And that's echoed in the second saying, which is to raise new questions, new possibilities. To regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination and marks a real advance in science. And this is saying that part of what we're doing in science, we're not just doing this for no reason. We're attempting to do this so that we're providing information for the other parts of the influences on these children and families. And part of what you're here doing is we're attempting to increase communication across these separate areas. So we've got science over here doing their work, we've got social services over here, we've got the legal system, we've got family systems, and sometimes the information seems like it's not getting across those different silos. And so today is an effort to help provide some of that information across there. But of course, just thinking about it isn't enough. What we have to do is think about how we can move from thinking to doing. But it's not always clear what that is. There's a lot of information that's coming out of science and different types of things. And what we're suggesting is that sometimes, from our perspective in doing the research, we get a lot of information, and then once in a while, even through the complexity, it seems like there's a simple answer. A simple answer that's actually within our reach, we think. And I'm going to talk about that today. Towards the end, we're going to come back to what can we do about some of these. But first, we're going to talk about the three core concepts of brain development. And what we're going to talk about here are early experiences affecting brain architecture. The second concept we're going to talk about is toxic stress and how that kind of can derail that typical developmental pattern. And then we're going to finish up with what kind of interventions are there that can help put that back on track. First core concept is that early experience builds brain architecture. And we're going to watch a brief video. This video was developed by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. It's pretty short, and then we'll come back right after that and talk a little bit more about it.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Great. Good. So let's go back and pick up on some of the themes in that video. The idea here is that genes are the blueprint, but experience is like the carpenter who's building the house. Recently, I'm going to say in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of new information about how genetics works. We used to think, well, you've got this father and this mother, you get a genetic set, you get your DNA, and that determines a number of physical characteristics and even some behavioral characteristics. Now what we're starting to realize, and we're seeing more and more, is that it's not as fixed as that. Through a process of what's called epigenetics, we're finding that some genes are just waiting, and when the right experience happens in the child's environment, they turn on, they express, and then all of a sudden they start having an effect on something physiological or behavioral for that child. For all of us, actually, all of us. And that has started to open up a new way of thinking for us, that whereas we used to think, well, we have this genetic risk, we have that genetic risk, and there still is that, but there's also something called a plasticity, where those pathways are not set in concrete. They're flexible to some degree. And that's a good news and a bad news story. So the bad news is that, hey, they're really susceptible to early experiences. So if you're in an early adverse experience, epigenetics is going to turn on certain genes that relate to certain functions to adapt to that experience. And those things may not be adaptive when you're not in a stressful situation. The good news is, though, that we can also use that same system to try and get kids back on track. So the idea here is that experience has to work with genetics for outcomes for these kids. And together, they make either a weak or a sturdy foundation for behavior. And that is, if early years are solid, there's predictability, safety, responsive caregiving. That's laying down a solid foundation for those kids. If those things are not present, then we have a little bit more work to do down the road. The second core concept is toxic stress, and it can derail healthy development. And so we're going to watch a video for this first, and then I'll come back and explain a little bit more about what we mean by toxic stress as opposed to just the regular usage.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. the body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, so the idea about toxic stress is when we're stressed, our bodies activate this stress response system. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's a physiological response to something stressful in the environment. And you kind of got a sense of that from the video. I know when I watch that video and they start playing the sirens and the pictures start moving a little faster, all of a sudden I feel just a little bit like, oh, what's happening? If you feel that, that is the physiological response. So we all have that response for something. When you see something stressful or something stressful is happening, that's happening in your body. And temporary stress is not bad. That's actually healthy. So if you were to have a short scare and then you recover, that's no big deal. If you go for a run or you do some exercise, you're going to activate a similar part of this system, but then it's going to come back down and it's going to be fine. The problem is that if it's continued, unrelenting stress, and there's no buffering effect of a caregiver, someone to take care of that. So as adults, we have strategies that we can use to reduce stress, but children often don't have those strategies. And what happens is the caregiver is the one who provides that. So when a baby's upset, it's the parent who's soothing, finding out what the baby needs, providing the thing that the baby needs, and sometimes what the baby needs is just comfort, someone to be there. And so the parent, in that case, is acting as the external regulation to the stress system because the baby doesn't have that developed yet. But if the baby doesn't get that responsive care, this system is still growing. Babies aren't born with a stress response system that's already fully developed. It's immature, it's still developing. And so it starts to develop a different way. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. How can we see that? First, a quick walkthrough of what that system is. On the right, what you're looking at is a kind of a view into the brain. On the right, you're looking at the brain. That person would be looking over this way. And you can see that up in the brain, there's a hypothalamus, and then some other parts that are related to the stress system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. I put this up not because you need to know the names of the anatomy, but the functions of the anatomy are important. So amygdala has to do with identifying things that are really important in your environment, often things that are dangerous in your environment, and reacting to that. When you hear about fight or flight, that's associated with amygdala. But it's also associated with really salient things that are really important in your environment. Hippocampus is involved in memory and spatial navigation, like where are things. But the memory aspect is important here because remembering the past of what happened is happening in the hippocampus. It's also not developed for young children. They're still working on memory. If you ask a If you ask a young child to remember something from a few days before, they're not always able to do that. But gradually, memory comes online, and they're able to do that. But memory is linked into experiences in their environment. So if they have positive experiences in their environment, that's in memory. Or they have negative experiences, that's in memory too. Prefrontal cortex is where you're doing a lot of functions on assessing your environment, pulling information from different parts of your brain, assembling them, and using them to make a plan. And so that's related to this because it gets filtered in, and all of these things send connections to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus you can see on the top here on the left image, but you can also see where it is at in the brain. It's buried deep in the brain, what we call subcortical. And the hypothalamus gets all these inputs from around the brain saying, hey, should I be afraid? Hey, something's wrong. And then part of that is coming from prefrontal cortex predicting that something's wrong. Some of it might be coming from amygdala saying, no, it's wrong now. And then the hypothalamus starts this cascade of events. What we're doing is we're trying to figure out how does something in the environment change something physiologically. There has to be a link. There has to be a link between what's going on out here and what happens in here. And part of that process is this. Hypothalamus sends a chemical hormone down to the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland releases another hormone into the bloodstream. It flows through your bloodstream, and it eventually gets down to your adrenal glands that are sitting on top of your kidney. And the adrenal glands start pumping out a substance called cortisol, which is a hormone. And all of a sudden, cortisol starts ramping up your metabolism. All of your cells that are producing energy, they start producing it faster. They're getting energy ready to go. Like, okay, we're going to do something. Something needs to happen. And that's really good, right? That's really good. What it's doing is it's allowing your heart rate to pump faster. You're getting more benefit from oxygen. Your muscles are ready to go. The problem is that like any other kind of engine, if you run it on the highest setting for an extended period of time, things start to wear out. And that's what happens in high-stress, chronic high-stress situations. So the system for short periods, great. Functional, works really well. But for extended periods of time, it starts wearing things out. It's associated with heart disease, associated with a number of physical ailments. So when you talk about high stress, over time, it affects all of us. In children, what we're interested in is how does that affect the development of the system? While that system is still plastic and still coming online, what do these really chronic periods of stress do to that system? So this was a study that Phil worked on. He's done a number of studies that involve interventions as well as what we call basic science onto what's happening. And in this particular study, what they did is they looked at the cortisol pattern from a number of children, and including foster children and low-income community controls. So we look at both kids and say, what's different about these kids? Do we have a different pattern of how cortisol works? And one of the things about cortisol is that it has what's called a diurnal pattern. And what that means is that for all of us, the normal pattern, the typical pattern of cortisol is when you wake up in the morning, within about the first hour, your cortisol is high. It may not seem like it, but really, it is. It's not about coffee, really. And so it's high in that first hour, and then gradually across the day, it starts to drop. About midday, it sort of hits a little inflection point, and then it slowly tapers off towards bedtime. And that's a normal diurnal cortisol pattern. And when they were looking at these kids, what they did is they had little kids. These are 4- and 5-year-old kids. They were in an intervention for kids in foster care and a matched set of control kids who were not in foster care. And the intervention was providing services to the foster parents and to the children. Therapeutic playgroups for the kids, but also support services for the foster parents. And as part of that study, they measured cortisol 2 days every month, once a month for 24 months. So they get, you measure cortisol by getting saliva samples from the kids. Kids spit in a little tube, and then you can check cortisol at different times of the day. It was like a pretty involved study. And what they found was the kids in foster care had much higher rates of dysregulated cortisol. Dysregulated meaning it didn't fit the normal pattern. So that top image is the normal pattern. The lower two images are dysregulated patterns. The first dysregulated pattern, the blue one there, is kids wake up and their cortisol starts high in the morning, but it never drops. It just stays high through the whole day. And that kind of pattern, long term, is associated with things like anxiety, depression, kind of mental health disorders for not just children, but anybody. And the second dysregulated pattern, the one on the bottom, is starts low and it stays low. And that was kind of a surprise. Like the thought was, well, these kids are exposed to stress. They must have high cortisol. Like their stress response system must be on high alert. But it turns out that a lot of the kids, it wasn't. It was just low all the time. And we started thinking like, well, what does that mean? And what can we do about it? And so in a minute, I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you some examples of what we can do about it. But the first step of this in the basic science part is to say, all right, we know that kids in foster care have these developmental issues like behavioral issues, mental health issues, things like that. How does that relate to a physiological thing that we can measure? This is one of those things. Those kids had much higher rates of dysregulated cortisol patterns. The other thing we looked at is called executive functioning. And executive functioning is a psychology term which is a kind of a cluster of developmental functions for all of us, but especially important in kids. And it's a group of skills that includes things like inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility. So inhibitory control, the ability to, if you have a tendency to do something, be able to stop yourself from doing that. Working memory, how many things can you kind of keep in your mind at any one moment? And cognitive flexibility is the idea of getting feedback from your environment and then adjusting your behavior so that it fits with the environment. And these are all very psychologically important points, but they're also behaviorally important. So those are all things that help children function in whatever environment they're in. If it's a foster care home or a natural parent home or a preschool, those types of environments require these functions. And these functions, like the stress response system, are not developed at these ages. They're still forming. What we wanted to know was, does early neglect and abuse affect the development of these? Yeah. Still? Need to be.
Just wanted to comment.
Oh.
The CRB board that I'm part of is specialized in adolescents, and these qualities, these attributes, are missing in these adolescents, and in large part because the things that you're talking about are not corrected on what I'll call the front end. And so a lot of what we see, the reactivity, the defensiveness, the shutting down, the resistance, it's not just adolescence. That just compounds it. It really is this lack of executive functioning. And carrying it out to the adult, many of the parents who are oppositional and in an adversary relationship to DHS, that's exactly where it comes from. What they're lacking is executive function, planning, carrying out things, seeing out the long term, because they're in that high state of alert and reactivity.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that, because that's relevant to this, and it's an important. We do studies also with teenagers, and teenagers, we were doing a study over the last few years on teenagers, and we were trying to figure out why some kids have higher rates of risk behavior than other kids. And so we're running a group of middle to low income community kids, but also a group of 11 to 15-year-old kids, adolescents who are in foster care or have been in foster care. And we had them do a task. We had them do a driving task where they had to decide about driving through a yellow light. And should they go through the yellow light or should they not go through the yellow light? And, but some previous studies have shown that if they go through the yellow, like they'll go through the yellow light or not, but if there's another teenager watching them play the game, they're way more likely to go through that yellow light. And what we also wanted to know was, for kids in foster care, what would happen if they were in a situation where they felt they were being, not just a peer influence situation where there was a peer watching them, but what if those peers were kind of judging them, and potentially rejecting them? So we set up a paradigm where it appeared like they might be getting rejected by a peer and watched their responses. What we did is we compared how they made decisions before that event and how did they make decisions after. And it turns out that I thought, oh, they're all going to just spike up their, they're going to all go through this yellow light. We had a game set up so that they couldn't predict when there was a car. If you went through the yellow light, sometimes you would crash, sometimes you wouldn't, and there was no way for you to know. And to win the game, you had to go when there was no car, but not go when there was a car. And it was a kind of a risk-taking measure. And I was surprised. They didn't uniformly just go more. What it turned out was the kids in foster care and kids who had, we had a measure of how much they cared about what other kids thought. They just started making bad decisions. They started failing at the game more. So they would go and crash, but then they would stop when there was no car. And I really came away from that study realizing that executive functioning was what was missing here. It wasn't that they were just purposefully doing risky things, it was they were making bad choices. And they were making bad choices because the way to win this game is you kind of had to watch the game, use your working memory and cognitive flexibility to adapt to the game. Other kids were able to do it, and other kids actually improved their scores dramatically, but the kids in foster care did not. And so it reframed it a little bit for me because I kept thinking, well, they're trying to prove something to their peers, and that might still be true, but what I really found from that study was that when there's a social pressure, it appears to be affecting their executive functions, to where in those moments, because they actually did worse in the social situation than they did when they played by themselves. They did worse. And that to me indicates that there's some pressure on their executive function. So adolescence is another part of life. Brain plasticity is very strong in the early years, 0 to 5 years. It's plastic all throughout life. Even for us, it's plastic. But especially plastic in 0 to 5. And then in that 9 to about 13-year-old range, there's another big shift in changes in the brain, in how the brain works, in how it matures. The neurons kind of proliferate in a number of areas up until about age, in social and planning areas, up until about age 10, 11, 12, and then they start pruning off to an adult-style pattern, right? All of ours are actually thinner than theirs. And the process of that has to do with the brain selecting which things are important to keep and which things they can start to lose. All right, that was a little bit of an aside, but the point is that adolescence is another important area, and executive function is important at all ages. So inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, they're built over time. These are not things that are present at birth. They're certainly not at adult levels at birth. And they're linked to important outcomes. These are clearly linked to things like academic achievement, IQ, success in jobs, things like that. Long term, these have very real impacts on these children's lives in the future. The critical factors, there are critical factors in their life that help shape these. And responsive caregiving is one of the things that we feel actually affects executive function. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a moment. And we know that toxic stress, in other words, if I look at executive function broadly across kids who have experienced some form of early abuse or trauma and kids who have not, there's a significant deficit in executive functions for the kids that have experienced abuse and trauma. So we're now looking at another way of getting at how does stress affect, like where is executive function in the brain? What does that look like? And what you're looking at are some areas of the brain that are associated with different aspects of executive function. On the left, you're looking at the side of the brain. That brain is a person looking over to this side. That little green area is what we call dorsolateral, meaning it's on the top and on the side, like right about here. And that area consistently shows up when people are doing tasks that involve working memory, keeping many things in mind at one time, inhibitory control, stopping yourself from doing something that you want to do, and planning, like pulling information from different parts of the brain, holding it in one place, and using it to predict events, like what if I do this? What if I do that? What if I do this? I wonder what will happen. And then making a choice. And on the left side, so that's really more of a logical thinking, processing kind of aspect of executive function. On the right, you're looking at up from underneath the brain. It's like you're underneath, you're looking, the very top of the brain where it's purple and green there, that's the forehead, but you're looking up underneath it. And you're looking up that way because that's where we can see it. This is the orbital frontal, meaning it's near your eye orbits, and it's in the front here up underneath. And this area keeps track of things like reward values, and it's very closely tied to emotion regions. Evolutionarily, what this means is if you're deciding whether something is a good idea, part of how you decide is whether there's a potential reward. If you were a monkey and you see a tree, and there's maybe fruit on that tree, that's an emotional event for you. But also if you see a lion hanging around the tree, that's another emotional event. And those things are all stored and kind of associated together in this area. It's about what are the consequences of making a particular decision. And we can apply that to kids because they all the time have to make decisions about things. Even if they're not thinking about it, they're still tracking the results of what happened the last time they made this decision. What happens if I do this in the classroom? Oh, what happens if I do that in the classroom? And both of those have different outcomes. And the value, the reward value of those outcomes is tracked often in this area. So when those things are deficient in a person, so for instance on the right side there, that is often associated with substance use. So either an extreme valuation, so if you have an addiction to a substance, what you're doing is the reward from that substance is outweighing all other possible negative outcomes for you. And you're choosing it because you can't stop choosing it. Over on the left side, those are associated with lack of attention, not being able to focus, not being able to keep on a particular item and screen other things out. Mostly attention is about screening things out and keeping your focus on one thing. So if you're deficient in this area, you have trouble with those things. And we see that pattern pretty clearly in kids with ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the rates of ADHD are much higher for kids in foster care, much higher. I forget the rate, but I don't know if it's double, it's probably 1.5 times higher. And what that means for us is that's probably not a genetic effect. There is a genetic effect for ADHD. If your parents had ADHD, you're at risk for that, it's possible. But the fact that kids in foster care have a higher rate than kids who were not means there's an environmental effect on ADHD. That's an executive function, and it means that their early environment is changed the way that function developed. So how else can we look at this? Phil and another scientist at the Oregon Social Learning Center, Catherine Pears, did a study where they first looked at executive functioning in kids, and they gave a bunch of kids who were in foster care or had never been in foster care a number of executive function studies that are designed to track all of those different aspects: inhibitory control, attention, working memory, flexibility, cognitive flexibility. And they found that, as I mentioned, early exposure to early abuse and trauma big deficits in executive function. And then they said, well, how else could we look at this? Like, could we get more specific than just the output of a test that they do? Could we look at it in a scanner? And so they did a study. Those kids that were 4 and 5 years old that got the intervention, when they were 9 and 10 years old, they brought them back into the lab and they had them do some tasks, some executive function tasks, specifically one called the go, no, go. I'll show you what that looks like, in a scanner, in an MRI scanner. First, I want to show you what the task is so you get a sense of it. All right, this is audience participation. Ready? So what you're going to do now is, when the numbers come up, you're going to see a series of numbers come up at different times. Any number you see, tap your finger on the table. If you see a number, tap your finger on the table, except if it's the number 9. If it's the number 9, don't tap your finger. All right? We're recording this. Okay. All right, so let's take a look. You guys are getting better. Okay, I think that's it. All right, good job. If anything, the idea we're working on here, the idea of a go, no, go is that if you do something repeatedly, there's something called a prepotent response. All the way down to the neural level, what your neurons are doing is like, oh, I got to do this thing. So they get ready to do it the next time. They're ready. It's kind of like a habit, like, okay, I'm just going to do it. And stopping that involves a couple of things. It involves remembering the rule. Wait, what's the rule? Oh, it's 9, 9, 9, right? So kids who don't have good working memory, that's already a challenge. The second thing is they have to be able to quickly send a command, right, that stops, like this one's ready to go. All of a sudden, the very first thing, oh, there's a number, I'm pressing, wait, it's a 9, stop, 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 on a very short time frame. And so this is an example of an inhibitory control measure, and it turns out that you can use this to kind of gauge where kids are at on inhibitory control. There was a researcher named Sarah Durston who took this idea, but she changed it a little bit for kids. So instead of numbers, she used pictures. And what she said was, if any of these Pokemon pictures come up, press the button, press the button. But if the cat-looking one comes up, don't press the button. And so the kids are like, oh, I get to play a game. That's awesome. They have fun doing it. They're like, press, press, press. And then we got a chance to see, like, how are these kids responding for inhibitory control. And what she found was that kids who had been these are actually not kids in foster care, by the way. These are just kids versus adults. She did this with kids, and she did it with adults. What she wanted to do first, this is way back in 2002, which in neuroimaging is like another century. And she said, oh, it turns out that kids are not able to, their performance was lower. Did you notice on the numbers when you were pressing that there'd be one number, then a 9. Then there were 2 numbers and a 9. Then there were 3 numbers and a 9. That's kind of changing what we call the level of interference. If you press something 3 times and then the next one is a 9, it's harder to stop than if you just press once and it's a 9. So if your brain is just watching for, is it a 9 or not a 9, every one trial, that's easier. The more prepotent response, the harder it is to stop. So she varied that. And it turns out that the adults did better. We knew that was going to happen. But it was how the kids didn't do better. And they did just fine on all the GO trials. They matched the adults. Everything was fine on the GO trials. Where they were not able to do it was on the inhibiting trials. They were not able to. And it turns out it didn't matter how much interference. It didn't matter whether it was 1 or 3 or 5, every 5th one. as soon as there was any inhibitory control involved, they just did worse. And these are just typical developing kids. They were 6 to 10 years old. So, but this is proof of concept, like what was happening. And in the brain, it turns out that their brain activity was different than the adults. So we were able to, they were able to map on brain images, and you can kind of see which parts of the brain blood is flowing to while you're doing a task. So we can actually the scanner's taking a picture every 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds it takes a picture. And from those different pictures, you can compare them, and you can get all the pictures of when they were pushing go, and you can get all the pictures from when they don't push go. And you can compare them. You can compare those pictures, and you can get an image of what was different. These are areas that were not only different between go and not go, these are all the no-go trials, and it's the difference between kids and adults. So these are parts that kids activated that adults didn't. And what that meant is that their system, number one, the broad message is their system's not mature at 6 to 10 years old for inhibitory control. Yeah?
So child is on the right.
Those are both for the children. They're, they just put up 2 different images because the parts of the brain wouldn't show in one image. These are both images of an average of all the kids subtracted from all of the adults. Does that make sense? It's a little hard to wrap your mind around. And the comparison is indicating which parts of the kids' brains were active during no-go trials, when they were stopping, that were different from the adults. And parts of those are things that we've talked about, caudate nucleus, which is involved in that kind of reward motor aspect, and also some parts in the back that have to do with spatial location. But the main takeaway message was that kids were different, and the system was not mature by that point, meaning that things that happen can affect that system. So then Phil decided, well, that's interesting. I wonder how that would play out in kids in foster care. So they did a version of that. This is like a pilot study. Not as big, and they didn't use the cool Pokemon pictures. They just used numbers. And what they found was that for normal control kids and foster kids, so we've got just typically developing kids over on the left, foster kids on the right. These kids were 9 to maybe 12 years old. And they were very similar, and I'm afraid this may not show super well, but in that middle the third row down, if you look across between the 2 different types of kids, you're going to see more activation in the foster care side. And what that meant for them in their analysis of that is they interpreted that as meaning, hey, these kids, first of all, their performance was a little bit lower, but also they were recruiting different parts of the brain to try and get the same job done. So to get the same job done, they were recruiting lots of different parts of the brain, whereas the other kids were not. Theirs were cleaner. They were focused on a few areas. That's maybe a hard concept to get, but the point is that if there's a developmental influence on improving a skill, typically what we see for that is that it goes from scattered, like I'm doing whatever, to by the time you're an expert at it, it hones in on a certain set of brain areas because you're good at it. You're not using all these areas. It's more efficient. And so that study really showed that, and it showed a difference in kids who had been exposed to abuse and trauma from regular kids.
Shannon?
Yes?
Would it be too much of an overstatement to say that it would at least be a working hypothesis that the distinction is brain architecture?
Yes.
In other words, the foster children's architecture is different.
Yes. I just want to make sure I use the terminology. This is what we call a functional scan, which means where is blood going when you're active. In this world, we differentiate between functional and structural. Structural is the makeup of the neurons. How much gray matter, white matter, how big is it, and what are the connections, the physical connections. This is where is the blood going. But from the standpoint of what I think what you mean by architecture is the operation of their brain was significantly different, very different. It's more diffuse, it's more spread out, it's not as mature as the other kids. So that leads us to core concept 3, which is caregiver-child interaction shapes brain circuitry. So now we're coming past the, early abuse and trauma makes a problem. That part was established. Now what we're saying is, okay, but what can we do about it? The plus side to plasticity is that you can still change it. So let's play another video. This is our last video.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Okay, so now we're cresting into if environment can alter these different functions negatively, how can environment alter it positively? And serve and return is a metaphor developed partly by Phil and partly by the Harvard Center for the Developing Child as a way to explain kind of what's important in the process so that people understand it. The idea is that children serve when they either say something, do something, or they're interested in something. So that's a serve. Caregivers return their serve by noticing or by providing something they need. Sometimes they'll name something. Sometimes they'll provide them some support to help them do something. And then things go back and forth. The child serves, parent returns, and it goes back and forth after that. This works best when you're with the same caregiver over a period of time. And that's an important point, and we'll come back to that. Because when you're with the same caregiver, you're better able to predict what is that interaction going to look like. Now I know what that interaction looks like with this caregiver. When I do this, this caregiver is going to do that. So changing the caregiver makes a big difference in this process. This happens anywhere that the child is. And that brings us to how can we think about it? Serve and return is one of those really basic, simple ideas. And yet, what's happening is all of that experience is going in and forming the basis of how that child's brain is developing. It forms the basis of their stress response system developing. It forms the basis of their executive function developing. So it's very important. The environment of the child is the thing that we have to work with. We don't get to go back and change their genetics, right? But we do have the chance to think about their environment. And so we're going to go through a couple of examples of how maybe we can think about this. Example one is, right now what we're going to do is talk about some efforts that have been made to improve outcomes for kids. So Phil, in conjunction with some other people, Jackie Bruce and Catherine Pears and Gig Levine went back and they took all the data from those kids that they work with, those little kids, and they said, what might be associated, what might predict which of those kids had dysregulated stress response systems? Which ones, is there something special about the ones who had low cortisol throughout the day? So you can see here, there's another picture of that low cortisol. And the three groups that you're looking at there are different levels, they're different types of cortisol patterns. The black bar, are all the kids that had low cortisol. They're the ones that had low cortisol all throughout the day. And on the other axis, what you're looking at is what was the severity of neglect? And this is not the severity of physical abuse. It's not the severity of sexual abuse. It's the severity of neglect. How much neglect was there? And you can see that they were higher than the others. That one of the things that differentiated the kids with dysregulated cortisol was neglect. And that was a pretty clear difference from these findings. So that brings us to some new perspectives. This has been replicated in, by the way, 2 other samples. Yes? So in this particular case, they were using, they were coding from case records. And so by neglect, there's a coding system that allows them to code, especially when the findings from the investigations show absence of care, either parents not there, failure to feed, failure to clothe, failure to provide adequate supervision, and neglect is the absence of those things. Does that make sense? Those were from caseworker records, from the child's records. Yeah, it turns out that was a really labor-intensive thing to find out. It took a long time to go through all of those files.
Shannon?
Yes?
We tend to think in pretty concrete terms in our work about what neglect is. Neglect is a dirty house. Neglect is not preparing food. But it's what's underneath that neglect, I think. It's the absence of that consistent nurturing relationship, which automatically takes you out of that serve and return kind of quality. So those concrete things that we look at are just the sort of outward symptoms of the neglect. What really at the basis is an absence of a proper child-parent relationship.
Yes, super good point. So when we talked about serve and return was not part of this record. What this is a failure to provide some sort of care like food, clothing, supervision, failure to have that child, just the basic needs. That's what this is. What we're finding is that it's actually the moment-by-moment interactions that take a toll on stress. So like, this isn't just that the child was alone and cried, although I'm sure they did. This was about it being so bad that someone noticed, reported, and it continued through an investigation. So this is really big, but even subtle instances can make a difference. And then that doesn't mean that you have to just sit and stare at your child 24 hours a day. You don't have to. But extreme cases really were very predictive of dysregulated cortisol function. The age group while they were in the study was 4 to 5 years, 4 to 3.5 to, I think, to 5.5 years old at the time they received an intervention. However, the records dated back earlier. So the records were not only at that age, it was anything in their case file. Yes? Yes. Yes, exactly. What the lady has referenced is we know from some international events, especially Romanian orphanages, a classic example, where there was upheaval in a country, lots of orphans not a lot of resources to care for the orphans. The orphans end up getting put in an orphanage, which is just rows of cribs, and they're just sort of left there on their back, staring up at the ceiling. Nobody checks on them. They try to feed them a few times a day, but there's no interaction. And in those circumstances, which is really a precursor to this, what they found was brain development lagged. I don't have the picture with me today, but if I were to show you a picture of the brain of a 14-year-old Romanian orphan, especially the ones that never got adopted, the ones who stayed in the institution, it's shriveled and tiny next to a typical 14-year-old would be big and robust. And that was just the visual. The executive function, way off, rates of psychopathology, disorders, astronomical. Many of those kids, depending on the age at which they were adopted, really never did recover from that. Some of them literally have flat back. The back of their head is just flat because they spent the majority of their early life just laying on their back on a crib. And motor development, they were short, their legs didn't develop. So part of development is us interacting with our environment, and our bodies adapt to our environment. And if your environment's a crib with no movement, well, it'll adapt to that too. Okay, so the perspective from that we're gleaning from this is toxic stress is not just about bad things that happen. It's not just about physical abuse, sexual abuse. It's also the absence of good things that happen, the absence of supportive caregiving, the absence of someone to buffer you when you're in a stressful situation. Neglect is a toxic stressor in and of itself, with implications for health and well-being that last long. Like, has anyone heard of the ACEs study? Probably you've heard of that. That's a large national sample of asking people about stressful events from their childhood. And then it turns out that that correlates very highly with physical symptoms in adulthood, heart disease and different types of ailments and life expectancy. And so what we need to do from this perspective is broaden our idea about development and what contributes to development. So we need to think about adversity-informed care rather than just trauma-informed care. And that's not a really good news because the overwhelming percentage of cases involve neglect. Neglect is the largest single finding for many of these kids. So Phil, with some colleagues, did a study on this. He had a larger group of kids who were in foster care, and he used the records to kind of categorize the profile of what happened to them. So over on the left here, these little different bars, the first one is emotional maltreatment, second one is supervisory neglect. So second one is neglect, third one is physical neglect, fourth one is sexual abuse, and the fifth one is physical abuse. And this first profile, they just took kids and they said, okay, who has which on their record? Who has which of these things on their record? And they grouped them. It turns out they sort of fell into 5 categories. One category were kids who had neglect. Those first 3, I think of them as neglect. And then the second 2, sexual abuse and physical abuse, was really low. So these kids didn't have a lot of that. The next group were kids that had neglect and sexual abuse. The next group were kids who had neglect and physical abuse, but not really sexual abuse. And the last group were kids that were sort of evenly distributed. They got all of those bad things. And what they wanted to see was how many kids were in each group. And it turns out that the largest group were the kids who experienced neglect. That was the largest group. And it's just to show the scope of the problem. And it's also a problem that we don't often think about. So we want to deal with neglect, but the way to deal with neglect is in thinking about somehow to provide stable, supportive caregiving, and that's no easy task. So the second example comes from a test of executive function, and then what can we do about executive function. So I'm going to try and go faster. Kids were brought into the lab, and this was an EEG study. So they're wearing the little cap with all the electrodes that measures brain activity. It's not in the scanner. And the task was pretty simple. They showed them this, and they said, does that center dot match the outside dots? Is it the same color, or is it not the same color? And they had to press. Same, not same. They just had to press a button. And if they got the answer right, like, nope, this one's not the same, then a little smiley face came up. And if they got the answer wrong, a little frowny face came up. And what this allowed us to do was to see what were the brain waves doing at the moment that they got the feedback. The point of this is not whether they got it right or wrong, it's what happened in their brain when they got the feedback. Oh, that was right, or no, it was wrong. So here's the kids, they're playing at a desk, going along, they liked the game. And what happened was interesting. Here's a squiggly brain line. This is what their brain is doing over time. And if they got the answer correct, the little squiggly line looked like this. You guys don't have to worry too much about what the line looks like. But if they got the answer wrong, it looked like this. And what that meant was, this is normal kids, by the way. These are not kids in foster care. The important part is that there's a difference between those two lines. These kids had a different, they responded differently when they got feedback that they were wrong compared to when they got feedback that they were right. So they processed corrective feedback like that. So in foster kids, though, these are all kids who have been foster care, they've been exposed to abuse and or trauma. Correct answers, similar. But interestingly, when they got corrective feedback, there was really no difference at all in there was no difference. They didn't process, from this perspective, they didn't process the corrective feedback at all. It was the same if I told you, yep, you got it right, nope, you got it wrong, and there was no difference for them. Behaviorally, that's really important. Why is that important? Well, because a lot of what kids have to do is process corrective feedback. It's super important. It's important in how they get along at school, how they get along with friends, how they get along with new foster parents. If you don't process corrective feedback, you're going to have a tough time. In the school setting, teachers would say, hey, Johnny, stop that. Hey, Johnny, stop that. Hey, Johnny. Or Susie, doesn't matter. And if that child doesn't respond and correct, it doesn't take very long for the teacher to go, this is a difficult kid. And then it turns out teachers treat those kids a little differently, as would be normal. You would expect that, right? So processing corrective feedback is an important aspect. So here's what we did. We'll go through this a little quickly, but Phil said, let's give these kids an intervention. He gave them, I think these were the kids actually from the 2-year intervention. And they measured their processing of corrective feedback before they started the intervention, which is over here on the left. That's pre or before the intervention. And there was a group of kids in regular foster care, and then there was an intervention group. So all these kids are in foster care. Half of them got an intervention. The intervention was support for foster parents, weekly meetings, trainings, skills for foster parents, and a therapeutic play group for the kids. Kids are brought in with highly trained teaching staff that model behaviors, social behaviors, interactions, all the things that we think would be helpful in a very predictive, consistent way. And then at the same time, the parents are trained on those same things so that at home, it's starting to look like this therapeutic classroom where you're guiding them to help them pick up on the cues and notice things and do the right behavior. So before, there's no big difference. These kids look the same. There's no real difference in how they process corrective feedback to how they processed not corrective. But after the intervention, the kids who got the intervention, all of a sudden there's a difference. That gap where that shaded oval is shows that those kids improved. They got better on this measure. And the good news for that is, oh, these things are still plastic. We can still make a difference. We can still move the needle for these kids. And the way we did that was supportive caregiving. was targeted to supportive caregiving and modeling in a group situation. Age at the intervention was 4 to 5 when they started, and it was a 2-year intervention. I put this in because I wanted to also mention that there is a relationship between inhibitory control, one of the executive functions, and placement disruptions. So what you're looking at is on the bottom axis, placement disruptions, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 7. And I think we know that they go a lot higher than that. And on the right is a measure of inhibitory control. This has been centered so that 0 means average inhibitory control compared to other kids. And it turns out that as the number of placements increases, the inhibitory control gets worse relative to other kids. And so that's a sobering fact because it's a challenge. That was also replicated, by the way, by another lab. Actually, the other lab did it, and then Phil's group replicated it. And that's difficult because what that means is that in the meantime, while you're trying to find good placements for kids, each one of those placements is a new environment for that child to map onto. It's a new caregiver, new signals, new serve and return, new sets of predictabilities. And it's harder to learn something if it's changing a lot. It's just harder to learn something if it's changing. And what we've found across different studies in different environments is that when severity of neglect is relatively low, it has an effect on stress response system, cortisol rhythms. But when severity of neglect is high, it has a much higher. This is what we call a dose response effect, meaning the higher the neglect, the more that system is dysregulated. It's a pretty good indicator that those things are connected somehow. And on executive functioning, same. Number of placements, the impact to inhibitory control was relatively low, but lots of placements, it climbed quite a bit. And so there's another dose-response relationship between number of placements and executive function. So what does that mean? Well, we feel pretty strongly that supportive care can leverage the brain's plasticity, and it can help minimize some of these effects. And it can minimize the effects on cortisol regulation, executive functioning, but we also know from just looking at kids and watching them through these programs that it affects their behavioral and emotional adjustment and their school success after that. We've done quite a few studies on that. Questions to ponder, and now we're coming toward our discussion part of the thing where you guys are going to be taking a role in talking about these topics. Here are some of the questions that we're going to ask you to discuss at your table, and then come back to us in a little bit, and we're going to ask a couple of people to share what the table talked about. So that's the idea. There'll be a microphone that'll come around. And the questions are, do you work with kids who experience toxic stress? If so, what are the sources of adversity in their lives? Adversity broadly defined, like what's adversity for them? What else can lawyers and judges do to promote healthy development, increase serve and return, and address toxic stress among the children and families they work with? Like, what are the things that are at our disposal, or at your disposal, even indirectly? So let's take 5 minutes. Let's take 5 minutes and just talk about that. And when we come back, also keep track of any questions that you've got, because we can answer questions too. And we'll come back and chat in a minute.
I will take about one more minute, and then I'll go at random to a few tables, but I don't want anybody not to consider these things. Are you about ready? I'm going to go. Ready? Can I ask for a spokesperson? We're gonna start here with this table.
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and listen to some examples of things that you guys talked about in response to these or adjacent topics. Like, what did you find?
Well, one experience was with a 6-year-old who's had quite a bit, we believe, toxic stress, where her parents committed numerous criminal charges. They had drugs. She was told to stay in a room with her sister and watch her younger sister. There was a lot of people in and out of their house. And what the result is she has been wetting for the last 2 years, not just the bed, but at school, constantly wetting. They can't figure out why. And we were looking at what can lawyers and judges do. I don't know if it's recommending this serve and return that the parents or their current caregivers, that they learn that. I don't know if that's what you're looking at.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, is she in foster care now or adopted care? In kinship? Yeah, and so that's pretty common, kinship care. And yeah, what you said really, first of all, what she said was there was a 6-year-old, lots of trauma and abuse, and since being moved into care has continued to have problems with bedwetting, which is common. We see that a lot, and some more extreme behaviors. And it's hard to normalize to a new environment. 6 years old, she spent a lot of time in an unpredictable environment. And moving to a predictable environment is really helpful, but it doesn't happen overnight. Here's a quick snippet. Language develops very early. The ability to hear the sounds in a language is probably mostly set by about 8 months. Hearing and being able to distinguish between different sounds. So if I grow up in an English-speaking household, I can distinguish different sounds than if I grew up in a Japanese-speaking household. It doesn't mean that that child can't learn a new language later. They can. They'll probably still have an accent because they won't be able to distinguish the sounds quite as well after 8 months. But they can learn. We could learn a new language. But it's going to be harder. It's going to take a little longer for us. And so when I talk to parents, sometimes I try to help them see that, and having them provide as consistent a care as they can makes a difference. And on things like bedwetting or any toileting issues, when it's chronic, it's sometimes good to check in with pediatricians too, because they will sometimes have some tips for that. But there are a lot of things, that video mentioned that not all the effects of neglect are obvious in terms of behavior. Sometimes it just shows up in something like bedwetting.
We have one here, Shannon.
We were wondering if you would give a definition for adversity-informed care, because everyone in the room has had trauma-informed care, and I think all of us clearly support better recruiting, training, and support of foster homes, fewer placement changes, all of those things. But I was trying to wrap my head around your definition of adversity-informed care in that context.
For us, the difference between adversity and trauma-informed is adversity encompasses the idea that there's a lack of responsive caregiving, not just a trauma that happens, a sexual or a physical or an abrupt change, like even the loss of a parent, or even just getting pulled from your family and put in foster care could be considered a form of trauma. And those are all important. But the idea of adversity informed includes also what was happening in the home during that time that wasn't directly a problem, but just the absence of that back and forth, the absence of language spoken in the home, the absence of caregiving interactions that are supportive and loving. Even just supportive would be good. And so adversity goes a step further, and those things don't show up always in case reports. They don't always show up. What shows up is parent was missing, parent left the young girl in a room with her sister and said, take care of your sister. And that's bad, but the part of that that's also bad is that there was no interaction with that child with adults. That child was put in a position of early responsibility that changed the way she developed. Did that answer your question?
I think so. Kind of chatting as I've been listening to you too, as well as trying to make some notes. Making a recommendation that just simply says better serve return says nothing. And so
I see.
Thinking more about better knowledge of foster parents. Sometimes they know what the kid is coming to them with, and sometimes they're basically going and a little beyond that. And then their evaluation is certainly based on the need of that child. So that's sort of kind of going from there.
Yep.
Shannon,
Yeah.
Can I put that in a little bit of context here?
You bet.
Maybe underneath that, I mean, the lessons from the data are, it should be our default assumption that 90% of the children that we see have toxic stress. That's kind of fundamental, and that overthrows the paradigm we have now about, for example, waiting until there's so-called acting out or some other kind of overt behavior to begin to address it, sort of the crisis focus. So the assumption is, I think, Shannon, am I right here, that all of the significant adults in a caretaker role in a child's life who's in foster care should be doing some form, for example, of this serve and return. Like, I see you and you matter.
Yes.
And there are many, many forms of that. Is that fair?
Yeah, very fair. And so first that, and also to your other point of, well, tell them to do serve and return more might be vague for them. And I agree. I think that what this approach doesn't do is it doesn't put the services in place. It doesn't make the services available. It just outlines what those services should look like. And what I can say is when we talk about family, like foster families or adoptive families, having an understanding of serve and return, like first of all, just on a basic level, any family can go up to the Harvard website and watch all these videos anytime they want. There's a lot of information there. That's not a replacement for an established program that you could refer them to. That would be better. But if the foster parents or the kinship parents or the adoptive parents and the people around them are aware of the concept of that supportive interaction, we go to a situation where now all of a sudden everybody's speaking the same language. And so if that child's learning the new language of supportive caregiving, the more people around them that are all speaking that language, the faster it will go.
I have a question here.
I was more thinking going forward, instead of assuming that these kids all have toxic stress. So going forward, so we talked about the therapeutic play group, that there needs to be that kind of therapeutic training for foster parents, figuring out a way to provide that. And the other thing is, so often my husband said, who comes to the hearing? Who comes to our hearing? The DHS worker. And sometimes that's the only person there. We need, but then there's a CASA there, and the CASA gives us another perspective, or then the lawyer is there. So we need multiple sets of eyes on this child who all understand this, and when you have multiple sets of eyes, people are going to pick up on stuff.
Yes.
And the other thing that came into my mind, I taught school for many, many years, is, fostering this serve and return is the foster home a print-rich environment? The kid is not going to sit in front of a TV. They need books. When you hold a child on your lap and you sit there and you read to them, that's that nurturing and that whole back and forth and back and forth, and limiting the amount of social media, especially with these young kids, which reduces the time for all this serve and return. You know, when you see a 2-year-old on a device going like this, that's not serve and return. And so it may be great for keeping the kid quiet, but it's not what that child needs.
We're building attachment, we're just building it to an electronic device. So I just want to make a couple comments about that are important. Serve and return. First of all, what you said, thank you, because that was really, gets to the core, I think, of a lot of the issues. What we find is we're doing implementations of trainings for serve and return in families. And the way we do that is we'll do it either in an individual or in a group. I'm running one now in Eugene that started off with foster families. Now we're working with kids that have developmental delays. And we'll film the family for about 10 minutes, usually the mother, but sometimes the father, interacting with the child. We take that film back and we pull out clips of them doing responsive caregiving, because we can always find that. If I put 2 people in a room, like I'm always, in 10 minutes, I'm gonna find it. And then I'll show it back to them and go, here was your child's serve. I'll stop the film and go, look, right there. That was what the serve looks like. A lot of times the caregivers, they're not thinking about it that much. They're going through their day and they're busy. You know how busy foster parents are. They've got tons of things to do. And so they're trying to get all the stuff done that they're supposed to do. And they don't have to do this all the time. But every once in a while, just for a little minute, like sometimes these are only 30-second clips, 30 seconds. And they just stop and I go, look, that was the child's serve. And look what you did. You turned your head, you paid attention to check in what they needed. You gave them something or you helped them do something. A big part of it is that you're following the child's lead. This is not teaching. We're not asking them to teach the child per se. We're saying, notice what the child is interested in or what they need, and just be there and make some response. It's surprising that a lot of people don't think of that as important. They don't think of that as regulating the stress system. They don't think of that as building neural architecture. And of course they shouldn't, right? I mean, they wouldn't have a way of knowing that, but that is what it's doing.
I want to put this in the context of our reviews and get really concrete here. One action in response to what we've heard here today is not to come up with the implementation of how to do it, even though that's the question. One reaction is during the course of the review, and question 3A is to say to the caseworker, I don't see anything in your case plan to address the toxic stress that this child is obviously going through. And if they say why it's obvious, and you say, I've read the case file, I know about the neglect that this child has gone through. Almost every mental health assessment that we see has, among other things, adjustment disorder. And the typical go-to off-the-shelf response to that is, child may benefit from therapy or counseling. That's not what we're talking about here. So I think that context is helpful. Even though we're coming up with ideas, our first job is to challenge the work that's being done for this child, because that's what question 3A says. And I have another question here.
Okay, this might have to be the last one. We're running close.
So I'm going to lay my bias on the table. I was a foster child and I was a foster parent. And the one person, although you just addressed some of that, but the people who get left out of this equation are foster parents. And if they don't feel supported and they don't feel trained, other than their own, we hope, good sense and caring, serve and response is not something that it's like, oh, great, one more thing to add to my plate.
Right.
Now, there's that parental grandmother, hey, I love kids and I'm going to respond, but again, it's one more thing, and now I have to diagram it, I have to write it down, So I just want to advocate that foster parents get support and not get left out of this equation, because they are the foundation of this system.
Yeah, my hat is off to them. What I do find is that the approach that we're finding most successful in that is not to say, hey, you have to do this. What we do is we actually film them doing it, because they are doing it, and show it to them and show how quick, how it doesn't have to be so big. And it turns out that they start doing it more when they understand what it is. when someone just goes, that thing, that was important. They're doing it already, it just increases the frequency of it in a positive way. Nobody says, oh, you should do that. It just seems to work. But thank you, because foster parents, adoptive parents, kinship, like, they are the backbone of helping these kids get to a stable environment. And I think
our time is up.
That's it. I'm sorry we are wrapping up, but if you have some questions, feel free to meet me over here on the side. And I also just want to say thank you to all of you for being involved in this. Like, it's a big part that you guys are playing.